Hello, welcome to another edition of Know the Bible, playing in simple story number 18 as we work our way through the stories of Scripture. Today is Queen Esther. If you haven't done so already, you might want to go ahead and read Esther. You can read chapters 5 through 7. It'd be great if you read the whole book. There's so much in the story. It's just really one of those stories that's worth telling over and over again. And indeed is the basis for the Jewish festival Purim, which is celebrated every year. Such a powerful story. In it, we get the story of Queen Esther and how she uses her position to save the Jewish people. It's important to kind of put this in context. We are during the time where there are still many Jews in Babylon. This is after the Babylonian exile. Babylonians have been conquered. Persians are in control right now. About 500 years before Jesus, give or take a little bit. If you remember from last week, it is after the stories of Daniel, but before Ezra and Nehemiah go back and rebuild the wall of Jerusalem. So folks have gone back to Jerusalem, but not everyone. Jerusalem's not completely built up yet, though the temple is pretty much done. This story about King Xerxes and his wife. They had a banquet, and his wife displeased him, and so he kind of exiled her to away from himself, you could say, and then decided to find another wife. And so he searches throughout the Persian kingdom, all the young ladies who might be a good fit for his wife. And part of that is then connects with the story of Mordecai, who's also living there in the city. And Mordecai, who's Jewish, is raising his niece, Esther. And Esther, the heroine of the story, is chosen to be the queen. And she becomes the queen for King Xerxes. And life is fine for a while. During that time, Mordecai, who has some kind of position in the court, overhears a plot to kill the king, and he ends up helping save the king's life in this sense. Isn't honored for it or anything at this point, but does save the king. Then also introduced into the story is a man named Haman. Haman is one of the top advisors to the king and is treated that way by the majority of people in the kingdom who bow down to him, who honor him almost like a god because of his position. Mordecai doesn't bow down to him because Mordecai is Jewish and Jews don't do that. But this infuriates Haman, and so Haman comes up with his own plot to kill the Jews. And he rolls the dice. There's a little dice behind me. May not have been like that. May have been. I don't know. To kind of pick the day on which to convince to have the king make an edict where all the Jews will be put to death. And he convinces the king of this, saying, the Jews have been rebellious since the beginning. Jerusalem's been rebellious since the beginning. The king goes along with it. He trusts his advisor. They decide, okay, let's go ahead and do this. He picks a day, and plans are set then to kill the Jews. At the same time, he has a special plan to kill Mordecai, but we'll get to that in a second. Mordecai hears of this news to kill the Jews because posters have been put up all over the kingdom to encourage people to do so. And he calls for Esther. And Esther has not revealed that she herself is a Jew, and she's also not seen the king for quite some time. And she knows that she could get in trouble for approaching the king. She's not allowed to do that. The only folks who approach the king are those whom the king calls himself. If you approach the king without being summoned, he can have you put to death immediately, unless he raises his scepter to let you in. So Mordecai tries to convince Esther to go to the king. Esther fears for her life. Mordecai says, who knows if this isn't the reason why you're in the kingdom for such a time as this, to help save the people. But then he goes, and yet, if not you, help will come from another place. So Mordecai's faith is still there that nonetheless things will work out even if it's not Esther. Esther asks Mordecai to encourage all the other Jews in the city to fast for her for a few days, and after that fast, she does approach the king. And the king raises his scepter to her and allows her entrance, and she invites the king and Haman to a banquet. And they're supposed to go to the banquet the next day. Interesting, that night, the king can't sleep, and he has some of his history read back to him just to kind of remember what was going on, maybe hoping that he'll get bored enough to fall asleep, I don't know. And he hears the story of Mordecai and how Mordecai saved his life back then. And so he decides in the morning, I need to honor Mordecai. Nothing's ever been done for Mordecai. And so as Haman comes in, all excited because he's got a banquet coming. He's invited to a banquet, and he's excited about killing Mordecai and killing the Jews. As Haman comes in, the king sees him and says, what should be done to honor someone who's done good for the king? And Haman, thinking about himself, says, put him on a horse with your royal robe so everyone knows how important they are. And so the king says, great, go do that for Mordecai. Which, of course, just infuriates and humiliates Haman. So Haman does it. He goes back home, says the plan's a waste because he has built a honor for Mordecai, and then he had built a gallows to hang Mordecai from. He realizes that he's not going to be able to do it because he just marched Mordecai around the town. Then he gets ushered off to the banquet immediately, and he gets to the banquet, and it's just him and the king. And it's at that time that the king turns to Esther and says, Queen, what shall I give you? Up to half of my kingdom I'll give you. And the queen says, I don't need that. All I ask is that you spare my life and the life of my people. At which time then she reveals that the plot to kill the Jews is really a plot to kill her and her people. And this infuriates the king when he realizes that this was Haman's trick. And so he turns against Haman. Haman gets taken away, hung on the gallows that he had set up for Mordecai. And though the king cannot reverse the edict, what he does is he writes a new edict that allows the Jews to defend themselves and, in fact, to even plunder others. And as the people realize that the king is now on the Jews' side, the tides are turned, and the Jews have the upper hand in this occasion. Crazy story, powerful story, lots of twists and turns, worth reading just because, there's humor in there. There are reversals of fortune. It's a fun book to read. Some interesting things about the story of Esther. One, I would say, from a human point of view, women aren't treated very well, whether it's the first queen or how the king went about getting his other queens. And just oftentimes they're just not treated that high, and yet God makes sure that it is a woman who is the hero of the story, but also in the sense of God himself. So interestingly how Esther is written. Esther is written without mentioning God at all, and yet you read it and it's so obvious that God is at this turn and at that turn and at that turn. And in many ways it kind of reflected life during the exile, where the people for so long did not have a temple. They didn't hear and see God like they wanted to, and yet they could still tell that he was active. So reflecting this on Christ, I was thinking about with Thomas, when Jesus rose from the dead, one of the disciples, Thomas, simply did not believe it. He said, unless I touch him and feel him, I'm not going to believe that he's risen from the dead. So Jesus, okay, that's fine. So he shows up for Thomas and says, touch me, feel me. It's me. And Thomas says, yes, my Lord and my God, he believes. And then Jesus says, well, you believe because you've seen, okay? And then he goes on to say this, and I think this speaks to the people in Esther's time, the people who were in exile, and even to many of us today at different times in our lives. Blessed are those who have not seen, who don't see, who don't see God called out, and yet still believe, who still trust that He's at work, because He is. And the story of Esther is so clear that He is, even though it's not written out specifically. That it is a great story to read and retell and to think about. So again, if you haven't had time, go back and read it at some point, get the other details, and spend some time with each other. What stands out to you? What's your favorite part of the story? What did you not know before? And of course, share some time in prayer with one another and close with the Lord's Prayer. And we'll see you next time as we move on to our next story in Scripture. See you then.